Yo, what's good everyone? Jinsula here with a brand new Pokemon Go video. I hope your day is going really well, and let's get right into it. So, today we're going to be talking about the Galarian Legendary Birds. In case you're not aware, we are getting an event called the Galarian Expedition Event, and it's going to be starting later this week. And with this event, the spotlight is once again on the Galarian Legendary Birds because their shiny forms are going to be made available after this event starts. It's going to be a pretty important thing that you use your daily adventure incense after this event begins because you will now have a chance at encountering a Galarian Legendary Bird in its shiny form. Now, let's say you end up catching yourself a shiny Galarian Legendary Bird. Now you're trying to figure out whether or not you should power it up because when it comes to these three Pokemon, there is a lot of confusion regarding whether or not they are any good. Well, for this video, I wanted to talk about each of the birds individually and discuss whether or not they are actually worth spending your Stardust and rare candies. And I have to tell you right off the bat, all three of these birds are not good Pokemon. They're not going to be useful in PvP or PvE content, and it's quite unfortunate because they are quite cool when it comes to Pokemon design. But in general, they do get outclassed by a lot of other Pokemon. And I think because of that, they are essentially just your best trophies in your collection, and that's essentially all they're good for. But first, let's talk about Galarian Articuno. Now, this Pokemon does not have the Ice typing like its Kanto version. It's going to be a Psychic and Flying type Pokemon. And unfortunately, it's not going to be any good. And the reason for that is mainly because of its stats. It doesn't have a lot of uses in PvP or PvE content. And I think it's because there's a lot of really good Pokemon that definitely outclass it. Like, if you want to just go type by type, there's one Pokemon that always will be a better option in PvP, regardless of whatever league you use it in. And that is going to be Lugia. Lugia is by far all around the better version of Galarian Articuno. If you're looking for a flying type, Lugia is going to be a lot better because of Aeroblast, and then of course with psychic type attacks, Lugia is definitely going to be king. And I do think that with Lugia, it has just much tankier stats and a much better moveset, so unfortunately, because it exists, there's never going to be a case where Galarian Articuno is going to be your best option. So yeah, unfortunately, don't ever bother powering up Galarian Articuno. It's not going to be worth your Stardust or your rare candies. But next, let's talk about Galarian Moltres. Now, when people think about the Kanto version of this legendary Pokemon, they see a Pokemon that is actually top tier when it comes to flying type raid damage. And then when it comes to fire types, it can actually hold its own. I would say that it's not necessarily an S+ tier type. That's really reserved for Pokemon like Reshiram, but at least with Moltres, it could still deal enough DPS where you could use it in certain raids. But unfortunately for the Galarian version, it's not going to be good at all. In fact, I would make the argument that among the three Galarian Legendary Birds, it is actually probably the worst. The reason for that is not just because there is a much better option out there that is dark and flying, that is of course Yveltal, but when it comes to Galarian Moltres, it doesn't have a high enough stat pool where it's going to be good DPS, and then on top of that, it's squishy enough where it's never going to be viable for PvP. And then on top of that, when it comes to PvP, there's just so many Pokemon you have to worry about, like those with the fairy typing or anything with like a rock type attack. So unfortunately, because of that, Galarian Moltres is never going to be useful. Out of the three, it's probably the coolest one in my opinion, but I think when it comes to gameplay, it has absolutely no relevance, and that is something that you should keep in mind, and I think it's quite unfortunate. Hey, Jinsula from the future here. So one correction that I want to make is that Galarian Moltres is actually not that bad when it comes to the Great League. It comes with a pretty decent moveset where you could have some type coverage, and we've actually seen some play with this Pokemon within regionals. So for what it's worth, this is probably the one Pokemon that you could have some immediate uses with when it comes to the Great League. And then finally, let's talk about Galarian Zapdos. Now, I will make the argument that out of the three Galarian Legendary Birds, this one is definitely going to be the most useful. And the reason why I say that is because in terms of the attack stat, it's reasonable, I will say, but it does have the unique type combination of fighting and flying. There's only one other Pokemon that has that type combination right now in Pokemon GO, and that is of course Hawlucha, and that is a regional Pokemon, which means not a lot of players are going to have access to it. So obviously the second best option with these typing is going to be, of course, Galarian Zapdos. Unfortunately though, it suffers a lot of the same problems as the other Pokemon. It doesn't have a very good moveset, and unfortunately, it also suffered from the major nerf to Counter. Before Counter was nerfed, this Pokemon was slightly better than it currently is. And I think because of that nerf, unfortunately, it is completely useless right now. Maybe in the future they could buff up Counter once again, but even then I will say that there's still going to be better options out there when it comes to fighting types. Especially when it comes to raid battles, there is a plethora of different really good fighting types like Lucario, Shadow Machamp, as well as Terrakion. All of them are going to be far superior compared to Galarian Zapdos. So yeah, unfortunately, this Pokemon is just not really good, and it's definitely not worth you spending your Stardust and rare candies on. So yeah, in the overall scheme of things, all three of these Galarian Legendary Pokemon are just trophies for your account. They're never going to be useful for your account when it comes to raids or PvP, at least in their current state. And I personally think that's unfortunate because they're some of the coolest legendaries that you can get, and the way that you can get them is also very satisfying. You have to get very lucky to get yourself a shiny version of any of these Pokemon. On top of them having a very low spawn rate, they of course are notorious for their extremely high flea rate, at least the non-shiny versions of them. At least for the shiny versions, I'm thinking that they're going to have the regular legendary shiny rate, not necessarily a guaranteed catch, but in terms of the flea rate, I think it's going to be low enough where you will be able to throw as many balls as you can to catch it, and it's not going to run away on the first missed throw. So yeah, that's something you could still consider when it comes to these three Pokemon. They're going to be the best trophies in your collection, aside from, I don't know, Shundos and any kind of shadow or shiny costume Pokemon that you might have. These are definitely going to look cool on your account, and if you end up getting one, maybe have it as your buddy because it's definitely going to give you some bragging rights. But of course, things could definitely change in the future. All three of these Pokemon might become viable with a couple of changes, and I really do hope it's something that Niantic considers. I don't think they're ever going to change the base stats, unfortunately, so there's always going to be better options, but at least what they could do is give them better moves. If they were to give some sort of move that would increase their DPS, I could definitely see a lot more play with any of these Pokemon. Currently, they all have one move in common, and that is Brave Bird. When it comes to PvE content, it's a pretty hard hitting move, especially when it comes to flying type raid damage, but it is a bit clunky considering that it is a full bar charge attack that requires a ton of tapping. And then of course when it comes to PvP, if you could bait out shields, it could be a one-hit nuke. So I do think that there is potential with these Pokemon. They just need additional moves in their arsenal in order to be viable, and I really do hope in the future they would get some better moves to actually make them useful in some way. And then another thing you have to consider is that maybe in the future we'll get the shadow versions of these Pokemon, and that could actually make them pretty good, especially when it comes to flying type raid damage. Considering that they have access to Brave Bird means that they might have the potential to hit really hard against certain raid bosses. And I think the shadow version, considering that the shadow bonus does give them a sizable damage boost, will actually make some of them viable in some cases. It's not necessarily going to make them top tier, considering that there are better options out there that also have a shadow version available, but at the very least, they're going to be pretty good Pokemon that you could use until you get those top tier Pokemon. Like, a Shadow Lugia is of course going to deal more DPS than a Shadow Articuno, but until you get there, it's going to deal more damage compared to, let's say, a non-Shadow Mewtwo, or let's say an Alakazam that's maxed out. Like, a Galarian Articuno might be a better option in those cases, the Shadow version of it, but yeah, it's not going to be the be-all, end-all Pokemon that you're going to have in your collection, so I do think it's not going to be necessarily worth all of the candy and Stardust that you will need to spend, considering that maxing out a Shadow Pokemon does require a ton of resources, and I just don't think any of these Pokemon are ever going to be worth it. Maybe the one exception might be Galarian Zapdos, because the Shadow version of that Pokemon will definitely be a top-tier fighting type raid attacker at least, and you know, maybe that one might be worth spending your Stardust and rare candies on, but I really don't know. I just feel like, in general, there's always going to be better options when it comes to these three Pokemon. So Yeah, it's unfortunate because I do think that these three Pokemon are definitely going to be fan favorites for years to come. A lot of people are going to definitely use their daily adventure instances on the daily trying to get those shinies, and I think it's going to draw a lot of lucky trades as well. If you are lucky friends with some of your friends, I guarantee you eventually one of them will be looking for any of these shinies because they are very cool. That's really all it comes down to. And yeah, that's essentially going to be it for this video. I just kind of want to share my thoughts and some of my analysis on the Galarian Legendary Birds before they come out with their shiny forms, and I do think it's going to be an exciting time, don't get me wrong. Even if they're not useful in any way in terms of gameplay, I still think they are worth going after, especially because it's free content. Like, set aside some time every single day, pop the daily adventure incense, and go for about a 15-minute walk. And who knows, maybe you'll get lucky and find one of these shinies, and it's definitely going to be an event for your account. But in any case, that's going to be it for this video. Definitely share your thoughts down below, what you think about the Galarian Legendary Birds. And yeah, if you disagree with me with anything that I talked about today, then make sure you share your thoughts in the comments so that we can have a great discussion. And yeah, that's going to be it for this video. I'm Jinsula. Be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I will catch you all later.